Hello there and welcome back to another video here on Wristwatch Revival. My name is Marshall. Thank you so much for coming along. This time around, we've got kind of a cool military watch from 1964. I know that because even though you can see the front is a bit beat up and perhaps a little bit rusted, and the keyless work seems to be at least somewhat intact here, the back of the watch actually has some engravings. It says Mike Rogers. It also just says Mike. Looks like Mike had a little bit of time to plow away on this thing. And you can see at the bottom, it says November 1964. And this was apparently issued by the U.S. military because it also says that on it as well down at the bottom. And yeah, a little looking around. And yeah, apparently these were used by the U.S. military. And this one belonged to a Mike Rogers. So I got this one off of eBay. It was listed as not running, and when I got it, it would actually work a little bit. So I figure we'll give it a service, and then we'll figure out what's going on with it from there. A lot of times the service is all these watches need. Interesting thing about this is that I try to get the case back off, but it's solid. The whole entire case back is solid, and what that means is in order to get to the movement, we need to take the crystal off of the front. And so I've got this crystal removal tool. And as you can see, the way it works is pretty straightforward. It uses those kind of claws at the front to grab on the side of the crystal and compress it, and boom, it comes right off just like that. Now you can definitely see there's some wear on the crystal as well as some rust on the inside of the watch. Looks like a little bit of water may have gotten in there at some point. The dial's in pretty good shape, though you can see the lume on the indices is pretty well worn. And let's see if we can just pop this movement out. It doesn't really want to come out. And I realized that's because the winding stem's in, but also I can't get to the part on the back of the movement where you loosen the winding stem, but it feels way looser than normal. So my guess is that it's one of those two-part winding stems, and we'll find out now. Otherwise, I just broke it. And yeah, it is. So this, the crown and the stem actually click into another section of the stem that then goes into the movement. So movement's out of the case. Let's get underway here. Again, we're just going to be servicing this watch, and then we'll figure out if that fixes it. A lot of times when you buy these watches off of eBay that aren't running, they just need a service, and that's kind of what attracted to me to starting to repair vintage watches in the first place, because well, then you can get some pretty cool deals on some old vintage watches if you know how to repair them, or know how to service them, rather. Okay, hands come off, and now we can remove the dial. You can see it's got a 24-hour inner dial ring and then a regular one on the outside. There we go. I'm going to take off the Canon Pinion first, but it's actually kind of stuck, so I'm not really sure what's up with that. And you can see it's actually running now. Kind of strange. According to the eBay listing, it would run for a little while and then stop. When I had it, it was fully wound, and it would only run under a weird circumstance. When I turned the crown to wind it, even though it couldn't wind anymore, it would run then. Thought that was a little strange. First things first, let's take the balance wheel off. And we'll set that aside. And then we can take a look at this movement and get working on it. I'm going to try to get to this Canon Pinion. There's a little cover plate here for the hour wheel and the minute wheel. Quite a bit of gunk inside of this watch. Also, kind of strange. It stinks. It doesn't smell very good. I'm not really sure what to make of that. And as you can see, there's kind of an interesting Canon Pinion setup here. It's not actually friction fit there. onto that post. It's actually a 2-piece thing, and then I can set those aside, take out this intermediate wheel just because it's going to fall out anyway. And now we can flip the watch over and start to disassemble the movement side here. So the first thing we'll do is take off this bridge that covers up 1, 2, 3, 4 of the pivots of the train wheels. This is an ETA or ETA movement. These are widely used back then and now. They're probably the most common movement manufacturer that you'll find. And in fact, many of your favorite brands today either use them today or used to use them, including basically the whole gamut. The Swiss watch industry used to be set up differently, where different companies would specialize in different things, and ETA was one of the ones for off-the-shelf movements. And so most watch manufacturers would say, well, I'm not going to build my own movement. That costs way too much money in R&D and the pain process of actually getting it right. So I'll just buy movements, high-quality ones from other companies like ETA. Now the trends have shifted, and consumers actually want the companies to build their own watch movements. They call those in-house movements. They feel more special. You know, they feel like a more unique experience, I suppose, for the buyer. But oftentimes, they're actually worse than the off-the-shelf movements. These are tried and true movements that have been used in many different watch brands over years and years, that have been really refined down. They know exactly where the pain points are and they fix them. When you see a company come up with their own movement and release it, oftentimes there's issues with the first run of it. So it does add to kind of a unique / coolness factor, but it isn't the most practical. It usually costs more as well. The other benefit to using these type of movements are that they are almost universally serviceable. You know, to even somebody like me, an enthusiastic amateur, you know, I've never worked on this particular ETA movement, but I get it, right? I see it right away, and I know where things are. I know how ETA does their stuff, and I'm like, okay, this is straightforward. Never even worked on this particular movement. It's always an interesting discussion to be had around movements when it comes to watchmaking and which watches you decide to buy. All right, well, we've got most of the train of wheels taken apart here. And I think I'm just going to leave the rest in place as I turn it back over, and I can take apart the keyless works. And as you can see, we've got a problem here. So first major issue detected. The setting lever spring is broken. It is no longer with us, as it were. This is the yoke spring coming out, and that lets me take out the yoke. As you can see, once again, there is a little bit of rust damage here, though it doesn't look catastrophic, but you know, this thing saw a little bit of water. So hopefully it'll clean up. Now I can take apart the main spring. First the barrel that houses it, and then the spring itself will come out. It's also always worth noting when you do this, which direction the spring is turning. As you can see, this one goes in a certain direction, but if you put the spring in upside down, it looks the opposite. And you want to know that beforehand, because you got to wind it back in the same way that it went in. And I've done it the opposite way before. And what ends up happening is the barrel arbor, the little circle in the middle, can't catch onto the spring in it, and the watch won't be able to be wound. So you want to make a quick note of that if you don't know already. Most of them are right-handed, as they call them. Most movements, but some aren't. And there comes the mainspring out, and you know, it doesn't look too bad. It's probably pretty old, but that could be a lot worse than that. So let's get this thing back together after it's been through the cleaner. And to get the mainspring back in, I'm going to use a little bit of grease. And when I mean a little bit, or when I say a little bit, I mean it. I'm actually just using this to kind of put a very thin film. I don't think you want very much of this. In my studies, if you will, I found that putting too much oil on the mainspring is not a good thing. It actually attracts dirt. Okay, now we can use our mainspring winders to wind the mainspring back in. If the mainspring's in decent condition, then these are really great to have. They're expensive tools, but they mean that you don't have to buy a mainspring for every single watch you work on. Some watches just need a new mainspring, and that's fine, but some don't. And this mainspring looked okay. It can always be tricky to get this little tab in at the end, but we got there. And there we go. Gotta love that feeling. Spring back in the barrel. And now we can reseat the barrel arbor. And one thing that happens from time to time, and that I don't always show on the channel, but I figured I would this time, is, well, we need to get our oils ready. The lubricants that we're going to use to oil this watch. Of course, they're really important. But also, you know, I keep them in this little tray thing that lets me get just a small amount, but they run out, right? And you also want to change them out every once in a while too, just in case anything is accumulated in them. And this is how I refill that. I actually take the little tiny oil thing and then I use tweezers to gather some and then just put some in. The grease actually comes in a syringe like this, so I don't do it for this. And then the oil that I use on the Pallet Fork jewels is also a little bit more firm, so I just sort of scrape some off. Now we can get back underway, but that's how I do that. Now we can put the barrel back together. A little bit of HP 1300 on the top. That's a medium viscosity oil. So you don't use it for the finest of pivots, but you use it kind of for the middle ground. And this little tool, pretty cool. I got it off of eBay for cheap. And it works just as well as the expensive version, which is like $30 or something. Okay, so let's get underway with putting this thing back together and see if it'll run. It's always the first step. And of course, the most important thing to do here are the train of wheels. And this one's a little bit of a tricky setup because it does have all four wheels under one bridge. And that means that we need to get the pivots lined up, both top and bottom, all at the same time, which is, yeah, it's a little tricky. There we go. And now we can try to fit the bridge on here and see if we can get these pivots lined up. So I'm going to start by kind of laying the bridge on top of all the pivots. And then what will usually happen is one or two of them will engage with the pivot holes and kind of fall into place, but then one or two aren't. And so I'm just going to very gently use this stick to kind of keep a very slight pressure on the top. And then I'm going to just very slowly move the wheels around underneath until they all fall into place. And it looks like they have here. And yeah, if I move the barrel, as you can see, everything's spinning. So that's really nice because, again, that isn't always the case. But these movements, they're well made. They go back together pretty easy. And now, once again, I'm going to be extra careful to use this little stick just to keep that pressure down, because now that I'm screwing down this bridge over the top, if one of those pivots were to come out before I screw down the screws, well, then that pivot would break because I would screw it down and it would be out of position and it would snap. And so what I do is I screw it down gently with the screws and make sure that everything looks good before giving it the final torque down. Now I'm going to put the setting lever screw into place before I put on the barrel bridge. Before I theoretically put the barrel bridge on. There we go. And this one goes on much easier. It actually only has one proper pivot there. That's the top of the barrel bridge. So we can get this installed. Now the click spring goes into place, and this one's actually kind of cool. It's not held under any particular tension because the click, which is what I'm putting in here, actually just bumps up against it. And I'm still just going to be careful by using a little helper stick here just to make sure that nothing goes flying. But as you can see, it actually sits with some room there. Normally, those springs actually hold it under tension, but as you can see, this one has a little bit of a different design. Okay, that means I can get the ratchet wheel into place. There we go. And that means that the crown wheel can go in. There's always this little washer that goes on the outside of where the crown wheel is. And remember, this is a reverse threaded screw, so you always have to be careful with that. Now you can take a look at the setting lever spring here. It is broken. Here's the broken part that was floating around in the movement. That could have been causing some of the issues that we saw. And this is what a new one looks like, or at least one that I found off of eBay. I don't know if it's brand spanking new, but at any rate, a certainly intact one. And that means that we can get to working on the keyless works now. So first we're going to get some grease. The blue stuff is actually grease. So that's the hardest core of the oils or lubricants that we use inside of a watch. Meant for high friction areas. And the keyless works is absolutely a high friction area. That, of course, is the part of the watch that's responsible for letting you both wind it and also set the time. You can put that intermediate wheel on, and now we can go for the winding stem. And it's a little bit finicky because I have to kind of lay the crown in there and it doesn't really click in. But we'll make it work. Now I can go for the setting lever. This is always tricky as well because you're going to want to pick this up and, apologies for the blur, but it's two-handed operation there. And then I can screw that down while holding it with my finger and we can see, okay, it's engaging and it's working. Now I can go for the yoke and the yoke spring. There's a pretty big yoke spring and there's not a lot of room. So once again, I'm just going to try to make sure to keep everything held down the best I can. And of course, I immediately fling it across the table. But thankfully that I had that black helper stick there, that actually kept it from really flying off. And now I'm going to be even more careful. And I just need to... It came out of its hold, but I just need to get this spring bent down up against that yoke, and there we go. All right, so that's business. I'm going to put a little bit of grease here between the spring and the yoke because when you pull out the crown to set the time, those actually rub against each other, and that's a high friction part. Okay, here's the new setting lever spring going in. So that replaces the broken one. And again, the fact that the actual arm on that had broken off and was kind of floating around in the keyless works, well, who knows what that could have done to the watch and how it runs. Again, any of these high friction areas, some grease gets applied where it's metal on metal, and you can see I'm just getting some into the loop here and a little too much. You almost always want to err on the side of less than more when it comes to greases and oils inside of a watch. So I like to clean it up if I feel like I've gone a little bit too hard. Now I'm going to take off a cap jewel, and I'm going to put that in some One Dip. It's a solvent that cleans it, and now I can put on just a little tiny dot of oil right in the center of it. And then I can take that very carefully, turn it over, and set it into place. And that was probably the best shot I've had. I'm actually getting better at this, but oftentimes it'll bump up against something, move the oil around on the cap, and you got to throw it back in the One Dip and then re-oil it and try again. But this one went really well. So that cap jewel's in place, and now I can start to put together the motion works on the other side here. This is a little bit of a finicky operation because it's kind of like a sandwich. The minute wheel here actually fits between two wheels on that center part. So I have to kind of put them both in at the same time, I guess is how you could say it, like that. And then there's just this little cover plate that kind of keeps everything in place. Okay, so main components together. Now we need to oil the jewels. And there we go. You can see just a tiny bit of oil when possible. That's okay. Not the best work with getting it on the side a little bit, but yeah, at least we got the right amount in there. And once again, now it's time to get to these cap jewels for the balance. Now this is kind of a cool setup. This spring actually has a little metal rod that you can see at the top that it kind of keeps it in place and that it runs along. And I'm just going to use 2 sets of tweezers here to rotate this until I can flip it open to get to the cap jewel and the jewel setting, which need to be cleaned. Yeah, it's kind of a nice little setup. That way the spring can't go flying off. So I'm going to use some Rodico, and that gets the cap jewel, but the setting is actually still stuck in here. So I'll use some Rodico to take that out as well. And this is what it looks like. That circle in the middle is dried oil. You can see some residue on there as well. And what it's supposed to look like is this. That circle you can see in the middle is now oil that I've placed in the middle between the cap jewel and the setting. The oil is then suspended between those two jewels. And then when the pivot is in there, it has a kind of a perfect set of oil that it sort of floats in, if you will. And that way it kind of suspends that oil right where the pivot needs it. And now it's time to close up this spring. And then I can just sort of nudge it around in a circle to lock it back up. Just like that. It's actually a nice little spring setup. All right, that brings us to the other side. This is actually the top. If you look behind my tweezers, you can see the balance spring. Gently open this up. And then we'll grab the cap jewel with some Rodico and see if we can't get the setting out of here as well. There we go. And now that that's been cleaned and again has a drop of oil in the middle, which you can see there, that middle circle is actually oil that's suspended. We can put it all back together. And done deal. All right, so here's a moment of truth. We can go for the pallet fork now, get that in place, and then we can put in the balance and see if this thing's going to run for us. Interestingly, the pallet doesn't get oil. All the other pivots spin continuously, but the pallet actually just goes back and forth. It doesn't spin all the way around. It just goes pink, 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 back and forth. And what that means is it has a much less friction overall. So they don't recommend that you actually put any oil on it at all. Okay, there's the pallet fork in its place. And now we can try out the balance and see if we've got a running watch or not. So we're going to get the balance roughly situated here. I'm not going to screw the screw down until I know that the wheel's in the right position. And right now it's not. This is what they call it overbanked. It's basically not lined up with the pallet fork properly. So I have to get it kind of over the hump, and there we go. We see life. Ah, it's a beautiful thing, isn't it? Really is the best part about this hobby, no doubt about it. And it looks like it's kicked up to life pretty well also. So I'm pretty excited for that. And this is without a full wind in the watch, which I'm going to try to do here. It's a little tricky because of the way that the stem kind of mates together. It just makes it hard to keep it in there. So screw it. I'm just going to use a pin vise. And we'll wind it up on a pin vise. And then we can see how it's actually running with a full wind on the time grapher. So let's see how it's doing. Okay. Minus 2 seconds a day at 300 plus amplitude. What's the beat error? 0? Pfft. Well, this is just fantastic. This is just the best possible outcome. All right. So I'm feeling really good about this because I apparently just needed a servicing and a new setting lever spring. But here's the problem. When I wound the watch, this isn't not an automatic, it just kept spinning. There was some point at which the mainspring was slipping. So I had to actually take it all apart, and look what happened. There's a tab at the end of the mainspring that holds it against the barrel wall, and it broke. I may have broken it when I put it back together. I'm not 100% sure, but it has to be addressed. So I have to take apart that part of the watch and order a new mainspring, which I've got here. You can see this is for the 2370, which is the model of the Movement. And we're going to have to just replace this with a brand new mainspring after all. So either it was fatigued too much, or I did it when I put it back in, or a combination of those. But it has to go, because this watch won't hold a full wind, even though it's good enough to run for a while. What it means is it won't run for very long on a wind. You know, it could take it from a normal one, which, by the way, you can see here, the little tab at the bottom is missing, and on the one in my tweezers, it's still intact. That's on the new one. And so I just wanted to show you that, which is why I took it out of the thing. But we'll put it back in and do it. But anyway, what it means is, sure, it can run for a few hours that way, but it's supposed to run for a couple of days off of a wind, and it'll probably only run for a few hours with that part broken. And that's just unacceptable. So we're going to have to do this here, get this barrel back together with the new mainspring, put it back in. It's always frustrating to have to go back and do work you've already done, but it is also part of the troubleshooting experience with these watches. And yeah, it just is what it is. So now we got to put it back together. Luckily, I've been able to keep most of it intact. You know, you can see that I only had to take the barrel bridge to be able to get the barrel out, so I can put that back on fairly easily here. And back on with the click and the click spring. Yeah, it's strange when you wind up your watch, and you know, you can feel it when it gets to the end. If it's a manual wind watch, it should stop you at some point, and this never did. I could just keep turning it, and if you listen closely when a watch does that, you can actually hear it slip, because it'll bring up tension and then it'll kind of let go. And that's what was happening with this. Now I'm going to give it another wind here and make sure that I can actually get to the end of the wind, and I just did. So that is fantastic. Now I feel good about this watch and like I've got it running right. So now we can put the dial on. As well as the hands. Minute hand going on now. And that just leaves seconds hand. And that means that we can get the case ready. I put the case through the ultrasonic cleaner just to give it a cleaning. This isn't the type of case that I like to do any polishing work on. This is a military watch. It's supposed to look like it's seen a little bit of time, and I'm not going to polish it up. Scratches are a good thing. They're a feature, not a bug on a watch like this. But a new crystal is needed because that crystal was way too beat up. And it also, I like replacing crystals because it lets you see the dial, which is the most important part of the watch visually. And as you can see, there's a little holder that I have to put this in. And then once again, in order to put the crystal in the front, I can't use my normal rober press, the crystal press tool that I like to use. I have to use this hand tool to do it. And there we go. And you can see you want it to grab around each of the edges here. So I'm double checking that it's not crooked. And then, yeah, you need to use some air here to make sure that there's no dust under there before replacing the crystal. And then you just simply undo the tool, and then the crystal expands into the slot. Just like that. And again, just doing a little cleaning work on it just to make sure that there's no dust or anything around. And it's a nice looking little watch. I'm sure it served its prior owner, Mike Rogers, well, and whoever ends up with it is going to have a nice little military watch from the 60s on their hand. And just double checking everything looks right. Now, what ended up happening, though, is I figured I'm done here. This thing is great. It's running perfect. I'm happy. But then it stopped. And it basically did the exact same thing that it had done before, where it had ran for a while, but then came to a halt, and I could not get it to run any further. So while it was running well, and I knew the mainspring was now in order, I had to do more troubleshooting. And again, this is tough on these things because it means taking the crystal off, taking the thing out of the case, and doing it all over. My first stop was the Canon Pinion. The Canon Pinion is what drives the hands on the other side of the watch, and this one has kind of a unique setup with this clipped-on bottom wheel and then the Canon Pinion. And after taking it out, as you can see, there's actually quite a bit of rust on there. These two parts actually are supposed to be separate. So I decide, okay, well, I'm going to de-rust this and see if that helps, because if the Canon Pinion gets mucked up, then it will stop the whole watch. The part that made me curious, and this is after de-rusting, by the way, is that it would be a little weird for it to be able to run for a while and then stop, but it was my first choice, and so I looked. I replaced that, it still stopped. So then I started looking at every single wheel under the microscope, and can you see the issue here? It's so subtle, it's honestly difficult to see. Look at those teeth at the top of the frame now. Do you see how they're worn down? Those ones right there? That's enough to stop an entire watch. Those teeth got damaged at some point, and what that meant was I needed to reorder another part. So I got that part that was on one of the train wheels, and now I can once again reassemble this watch for the third time and get it going. I'm not going to make you suffer through the full drawn out reassembly, so I'm giving you kind of the quick version here, but everything going back into place from scratch once again. And this time, I put it on the time grapher. It was running great and it ran all night long, no problem. I've been wearing it for a couple of days, no issues at all. And we finally have a fully functional and fixed watch. This has been one of those journeys. These ones are tough, right? Troubleshooting is hard. It can be very difficult to sort out exactly what's going wrong. And this one actually had 3 separate issues, right? It had 2 parts that need to be replaced, plus the mainspring replacement as well. And at the end of the day, though, we got a nice little watch here. And I'm really proud of the work I've done on it and the fact that I brought it back to life and that somebody can enjoy the watch. I wanted to say thank you so much for joining me for this video. I really appreciate that you take the time to hang out with me and explore this awesome hobby of watch repair and watchmaking. If you want to see more, you can follow me on Instagram. I do post some posts on there in between projects and a few things like that. It's wristwatch_revival over on Instagram. And if you'd like to support what I'm doing here on Wristwatch Revival, you can head over to my Patreon. It's patreon.com/wristwatchrevival. You get some cool benefits, and it's a way to support some of your favorite creators. I want to say thank you to everybody that supports me on Patreon, and particularly Trevor, Robert, Mitchell, Mikey, James, George, Erica, Dustin, Brinton, Brett, Alex, Melissa, and Brad. Thanks once again for watching. We'll see you next time.